Hello and welcome to the Daily Debrief Downloads Week in Review, a special edition within our usual audio series in which we take a look back at the biggest stories and the breaking news from the Oceanographic newsroom. I'm Rob Hutchins, news editor here at Oceanographic magazine, and for this episode, well, there are two of us, because I'm joined by Oceanographic magazine's social media manager, Ben Hartley, who today will not only be sharing his perspective on the depth and breadth of stories covered by the newsroom this week, but joining me as we take a more casual swim across some of the biggest, the most impactful, and the most intriguing headlines. Ben, hello. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Rob, hi, I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
Very well, thanks indeed. So usually then, to explain for those finding us here for the first time, we like to offer a review of the news from the past week by taking a look behind 5 or 6 headlines that we believe have been the most impactful or simply the most fascinating. Last week, for example, we led this segment with a dive into the concerning study on an underwater pandemic bringing life-threatening disease to sea urchins across the Indian Ocean. We then asked what's behind the headline on a news story about Disney's plans to switch its manatee care program to a short-term urgent manatee care facility. And then we talked about the deep-sea humpback anglerfish, which made a very surprising visit to the ocean surface off the coast of Tenerife. So to kick things off here, Ben, perhaps you could talk us through the stories that you've found the most interesting or that have piqued your interest over the last week.
Absolutely, and I'd say the top story that's definitely piqued my interest this week was the severe bleaching that has left swathes of coral basically on the brink of death in Australia.
Yes, now this is a heartbreaking story on the extensive coral bleaching that we've seen across Ningaloo Reef in West Australia. It's a story that broke last week. We've seen images and footage of swathes of coral turn this ghostly pale white colour, and it's driven local conservation groups to demand the strongest response from local government. So what struck you most about this story then, Ben?
I think what really struck me about this story was the imagery and footage itself. You know, these stark images of these coral reefs essentially going through a slow death.
Absolutely, yeah, and that leaves a resonating sort of message with everyone that's close to these coral reefs, everyone that sort of depends on these economically or with a vested interest, but also everyone outside looking in. But there is a single slight message of hope still. It's not all doom and gloom here, and it's to do with the process of coral bleaching itself. Now, coral bleaching doesn't necessarily spell death for corals. We've seen studies where coral reefs can actually bounce back from such a bleaching event. What drives it is a marine heat wave. As it travels through that ocean, it warms up the ocean areas around these corals, and it forces the corals into this sort of fight or flight response where it ejects the algae that lives symbiotically within it. It's this algae that gives it its usual vibrant colour. But by ejecting it, it's its last ditch attempt to cling on to life. But it's that process that gives it a week or two of this window in which it could potentially bounce back under the right conditions, of course, under the cooling temperatures of the ocean. So right now it's on this brink of death, but it doesn't mean that this is the end of the coral reef in Ningaloo Bay. It could well bounce back.
Absolutely, and it's absolutely fascinating stuff and a really interesting response mechanism from the coral reef itself.
I think what's made this more impactful, this story, is just the sheer size. I think it's the footage. I think it's the fact that this has been really driven home for us, that this is a real life impact of warming ocean temperatures in action. Right, so Ben, we move on from the biggest story of the week to our segment where we ask what's behind the headline. So what is the headline this week that has caught your interest here?
Yes, very interesting one this week, which was the Ocean Alliance lifts a veil of opaque oil spill reporting in UK waters. So this story obviously about Oceana UK, who has just released their interactive map showing all the major oil spills across UK waters. And what I thought was really important here, and you mentioned it in your article yourself, was that nearly 1/3 of breach reports between January 2021 and May 2024 failed to actually include the volume of oil spilled, meaning that the true level of pollution is likely much higher than we actually know.
Yeah, this is an absolutely astonishing story, and it just goes to show the level of the level of damage being done by oil and chemical spills in UK waters. So Oceana have actually given us some indication as to the extent of this. So in the last year alone, 82,000 kilograms of oil and 149,000 kilograms of chemicals were spilled into British waters. So uncovering the scale of toxic pollution here caused by the oil and gas industry. This new live map has, for the first time, brought together all this data and all this live information from across these governmental databases to provide a clearer view of just how damaging these spills can be. Until now, this data has been largely hidden away across what campaigners have called an opaque and misleading reporting system. So this is the latest bid from Oceana to actually empower the UK public. So it's developed this interactive map. This enables the public to investigate individual spills, to discover the kind of companies that are responsible for them, to check whether action's been taken against them by government, and to simply raise the alarm bell themselves. The wider objective here being, of course, is to get the government to fully implement and make permanent its ban on new oil and gas developments in the UK waters.
Brilliant, and thank you so much for explaining that, Rob. But circling back to what we were saying, the actual story behind the headline itself is the story of how much data is not actually being reported by these big oil companies due to the self-regulation that goes on within the industry.
Absolutely, you're completely right there. And also add to that the fact that when these laws are enforced, the sort of punishments that are being dealt out to big oil companies just aren't touching the side. So one case study we have here of one fine being issued, it was against BP, it was in 2016, and it was for the grand total of £7,000, which is essentially 0.006% of their annual earnings, which is absolutely mind-boggling. Right, so thank you very much for that one, Ben. So now we come to the part where we ask, what's the most intriguing story that you've seen on the Oceanographic Newsroom this week?
Absolutely. This is quite an exciting one for me. And it was the fact that scientists have figured out that wild fish can actually recognize individual humans themselves. So researchers from the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior actually launched a study to determine whether these fish could distinguish individual humans. And the way that they did this was really interesting. They had divers which wore red pieces of clothing feed the fish, and over time slowly took away these visual cues. And what they found was the fish would still go up to these divers when they weren't wearing these visual cues, showing that they aren't just remembering the color, but the actual person themselves.
Yeah, it's amazing actually to have done this level of study on the cognitive behavior of fish. I think this could be transformative for our understandings of the intelligence or even the memory that fish have, and maybe even our relationship that we have with life under the water.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with you there. It really brings into question the intelligence of these animals and how better regulations are needed in order to protect these intelligent species.
I think it's all about our evolving relationship with life under the water. Yes, thank you very much for that one. Now then, it's the final segment of our review of the week, where we ask what have been the biggest hits or the biggest misses across the Oceanographic Newsroom. So Ben, what would you say has been your biggest hit of the week?
Yes, so the biggest hit of the week for me would be how researchers at the University of Hawaii have made the incredible discovery that not only do local species of fungi have the ability to degrade plastic, but some can also be trained to do it faster. So, of course, found in seaweed, coral, and sponges off of Hawaii's shore, these fungi are able to absorb these microplastics and turn them into carbon and energy, which they store and then use.
That's fascinating, and because obviously we know that microplastic pollution in the ocean is a pretty much an existential crisis right now. We know that our oceans are littered with plastic particles. We know that recent studies that have found plastic particles in almost everywhere now, from dolphin breath to human brains. So we know that any sort of approach that we can take to getting rid of microplastics for a start is a leap forward for humanity and for life on Earth. But I guess the next step there would be actually stemming it at the source of the issue rather than trying to address the symptoms. But a fascinating study nonetheless. Now then, should we move on to the miss of the week? And I can bet you my last 2 pence who might be surfacing here. But take it away, Ben. Who do you think it is?
Absolutely. I think you've got it on the spot there. The miss for the week for me is Trump's utter contempt for ocean protection as he faces legal action. So, of course, before leaving office in January this year, the former President Joe Biden moved to protect large areas of the ocean around the North American coastline from future and oil gas leasing. However, President Trump is currently trying to revoke this order.
Yes, Trump at it again, it would seem. So yes, this is the news that conservation groups have filed the first environmental lawsuit against the Trump administration to protect the ocean from offshore drilling, calling out the attempts made by the US president to strip coastal communities of protections as an utter contempt for the law. So before leaving office in January this year, the former President Joe Biden moved to protect large swathes of the ocean around North America from future oil and gas leasing. Of course, Trump's come in and is trying to revoke all of these orders. But actually, the lawsuit states that Trump, this is the exact authority that Biden's used to enact these protections that you yourself used when you were first in office back in 2017, when you moved to protect the Gulf of Florida. So it's another astonishing piece of, you don't know whether you're coming or going with the Trump presidency and administration right now, do you? But thank you very much, Ben, for bringing all of these stories to our attention this week. And thank you everyone for sticking around and listening to everything we had to say. This has been the Daily Debrief Downloads Week in Review. I've been Rob Hutchins.
I've been Ben Hartley.
You have been Ben Hartley. Thank you so much for listening.